After fronting their emergency, I saw my golden sister's vacation post. Then I quietly cut every payment and took the property deed back. So I, 35, male, have been running my own farm for about a decade. It's not some giant industrial operation, but it's solid. Around 40 acres of mostly corn and soybeans, plus a small apple orchard my wife Nora, 32, female, and I added a few years back. It pays the bills, keeps us busy, than sure as hell beats working for someone else. Growing up, my parents, Tom, 63, male, and Sophia, 60, female, were absolute masters of emotional manipulation, like PhD-level pros who could teach a master class. My sister, April, 37, was the golden child from day one. She could burn down the house, and they'd call it creative expression. Meanwhile, I got chewed out for forgetting to take out the trash. Classic. Once, when I was around 10, April broke Mom's favorite vase playing catch inside. They consoled her as she fake cried about feeling bad. A few weeks later, I spilled some juice and got sentenced to scrubbing floors for a week. Different planets, different rules. At 16, I needed $200 for a school trip. Literally, every other kid was going. My parents said money was too tight. Then the very next day, they bought April a $1,200 laptop because she was feeling down after flunking another math test. When I called it out, Dad hit me with, "April needs more support than you. She's sensitive. Yeah, sensitive to not getting her way within 30 seconds. I picked up extra shifts at the local grocery store and paid for that trip myself. Should have been a giant red flag, but when you're raised in dysfunction, you start thinking it's normal, that you're the problem. April dropped out of college to find herself, read, party nonstop for 3 years, and my parents covered every dime, rent, car payments, credit cards, all of it. When I asked for a small loan to fix my first tractor, suddenly it was, "We're really tight on money right now, Jake." This came right after they got back from a 2-week Alaskan cruise. I worked through college, every cent from scholarships, student loans, weekend jobs, you name it. April, meanwhile, was coasting through her 3rd major at her 3rd college on the bank of Mom and Dad. When I finally graduated and decided to take over my grandfather's farm, they treated it like I'd thrown my life away. Dad even asked if I was settling for mediocrity, this from a guy who sat in the same middle management office chair for 35 years. When Nora and I had our daughter Zoe, she's 4 now, I thought things might finally change, like maybe grandparent mode would kick in. Nope. They barely acknowledged Zoe existed while practically co-parenting April's kids, Tyler, 8, male, and Madison, 6, female. Every time April needed a mommy break, which for her was all the time, they'd show up late to Zoe's birthday, stay 20 minutes, bring some dollar store junk, then rush out because April needs us to pick up the kids. Meanwhile, they were building entire bedrooms for April's kids, taking them to Disney, just the full golden grandchild treatment. When Zoe was born 2 months premature and had to spend 3 weeks in the NICU, they visited exactly once for maybe 20 minutes. Why? Because Tyler had a dance recital. When April's 2nd kid was born with a common case of jaundice, they moved into her house for a month to help. Still, I kept bailing them out financially. Nora thought I was out of my mind, but I couldn't shake that wired-in need for approval. Over 5 years, I probably dumped close to $75,000 into their endless emergencies. New roof, medical bills, car repairs, property taxes they forgot about. You name it, I paid for it. Last year, my truck's transmission died. Peak harvest season, absolute nightmare. We were so broke I had to delay the $2,800 repair, borrowing equipment just to stay afloat. That same week, Mom called crying about a broken furnace. I scraped together $1,500 for them while Nora and I ate ramen and used our neighbor's truck at 5 a.m. to get crops in. Later, I found out through my cousin that they used that money for a weekend spa getaway for April's birthday. Did I confront them? Nope. Just kept playing the role of personal ATM. Every single time I told myself, this is the last time. Mom would cry. Dad would lay on the guilt. We sacrificed everything for you, and I'd cave. I'd write the check and die a little more inside when Nora gave me that look. Not mad, just disappointed. And that was worse. Every month, like clockwork, a new crisis would show up. And every month, dumbass me would fix it because that's what family does, until 4 months ago. That's when everything changed. It was late February, just after a brutal cold snap almost destroyed our early seedlings. We'd been working 16-hour days trying to salvage what we could. I was seriously stressing about making our next equipment payment when my parents hit me up with another sob story. The furnace died again and they needed $4,200 right away or they'd freeze to death. It was peak winter, so I didn't question it. I drained most of our emergency fund and wired them the money that same day. This meant postponing some critical irrigation upgrades we'd been planning, but whatever. Family first, right? Nora had that look again when I told her. She didn't even argue anymore. Just this quiet resignation that killed me inside. We'd been planning to use part of that money to send Zoe to a summer camp program all her little friends were going to. Now that wasn't happening. But hey, at least my parents wouldn't freeze to death in their supposedly broken-down house. 2 days later, Nora stormed into the kitchen looking ready to commit homicide. She silently shoved her phone in my face, hand literally shaking with rage. Look at this. There on the screen was April's Instagram, posted 6 hours earlier. A selfie of her, my parents, and her kids on some tropical beach, blue water, white sand, fancy drinks with little umbrellas. The caption read, "Surprise Bahamas getaway with mom and dad. Oh my gosh, best gift ever, blessed, family first." The timestamp showed they'd left the day after I sent the furnace money. I felt like someone had punched me in the gut. There was my mom, supposedly too frail to visit our farm and see her granddaughter, freaking parasailing in crystal blue waters. My dad, who claimed his back was too bad to work even part-time, was carrying both of April's kids on his shoulders in the ocean. The proof was right there in filtered 1080p glory. Nora just stared at me with a look that said absolutely everything without a single word. She'd been telling me for years they were using me, and I never wanted to believe it. Now the evidence was completely undeniable. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. They just assumed I was such a pushover that they could straight up rob my family and I'd do nothing about it. And the worst part, until that moment, they were absolutely right. I didn't confront them right away. I was too pissed to trust myself. Instead, I spent a week hate-scrolling through April's social media as more photos appeared. Fancy restaurants, swimming with dolphins, shopping bags from designer stores, all funded by my furnace emergency money. There were literally dozens of posts. My family living it up in paradise while we scraped by. The most infuriating part was how they were all tagging each other, commenting on each other's posts, completely forgetting I could see everything. Or maybe they just didn't care. Maybe they thought I was too much of a doormat to ever stand up to their BS. Meanwhile, we'd had to tell Zoe we couldn't afford to send her to that little summer camp program she wanted. The one that cost a fraction of what I just handed over to fund their secret vacation. She didn't throw a fit or anything, just looked at us with those big eyes and said, "That's okay, the freaking guilt." My buddy Marcus noticed something was off when I came in for feed at his farm supply store. We've been tight since high school, and he's one of the few people who knows the full story with my family. I wordlessly showed him the Instagram posts. The look on his face shifted from confusion to pure rage. He pointed out they weren't just stealing from you. They were stealing from Nora and Zoe too. That was your kids' future they were blowing on beach umbrellas and room service. Marcus had always been straight with me about my parents. Unlike most people who'd just nod sympathetically, he'd call me out on my BS, "You're not helping them, you're enabling them." But I never listened. This time, though, his words hit different. "They're laughing at you, man. While you're working your ass off, they're laughing at you." That night, I finally called them. Dad answered, sounding crazy relaxed with laughter in the background. I asked about the new furnace. The line went dead silent before he stammered about how great it was working. When I mentioned they hadn't been home to use it for the past week, there was an even longer pause. Dad tried his fake confusion routine that I'd fallen for a million times before, but this time I cut him off and straight up called him out on the vacation they took with my $4,200. The phone rustled as Mom grabbed it from him and launched into the same old excuses. They were going to pay me back. April surprised them with tickets. They couldn't say no. I hung up mid-sentence. My phone immediately blew up with calls. When I didn't answer, they called Nora. When she didn't answer, they tried again and again for hours. By morning, my phone showed 14 missed calls and a bunch of texts about how I was overreacting, jumping to conclusions, and how they'd explain everything when they got back. For the first time in my life, I didn't give a single fuck about whatever excuse they'd come up with next. While my parents were living it up in the Bahamas, I was doing some serious thinking and some serious research. I dug through years of bank statements, calculating exactly how much I'd loaned them. The number made me physically sick. $78,350 over 5 years, not counting all the smaller stuff that didn't leave a paper trail. Birthday gifts I never got. Christmas presents that were obviously from the dollar store while April got iPads. Time I spent fixing things at their house for free. They got back from the Bahamas on a Tuesday. Wednesday morning, they showed up at our farm unannounced. I was out in the field when Nora radioed me on the two-way that they were all in our kitchen. I stormed into my own house to find them making themselves completely at home. Mom was trying to hug Zoe, who was hiding behind Nora's legs. Dad was sitting at our table like he owned the place. April was leaning against the counter, scrolling through her phone, looking bored. I quietly told them to get out. Dad stood up with his serious face, the one he always used when trying to make me feel like a child, and started his speech about understanding I was upset but hostility wasn't necessary. I cut him off mid-sentence. I laid out exactly what they'd done. Lied about the furnace to get my money, gone on vacation while I worked 80-hour weeks, ignored Zoe's birthdays for years while taking her college fund to go swimming with dolphins. Mom laughed and dismissed the idea of it being part of a college fund, claiming $4,000 wasn't a fortune. Nora coldly corrected her that it was $4,200 and absolutely part of our daughter's future. April finally looked up from her phone and took a shot at the farm, suggesting I wouldn't be so bitter about helping my parents if my precious little farm was actually successful. Something in me snapped. I blurted out that I'd given them over $75,000 in 5 years. Even April looked shocked at that number while my parents quickly tried to downplay it. Dad pulled the classic "we raised you" card, implying I owed them for basic parenting. I responded by slapping down a folder containing records of every payment ID made to them over 5 years, bank statements, copies of checks, transfer confirmations, all highlighted and totaled to $78,350, not even counting the fake furnace money. I demanded they pay it back or stay away from my family permanently. Mom gasped, like I'd physically hit her. When she asked if I would really charge my own parents after everything they'd done for me, I challenged her to name a single thing they'd done for me in the past decade that wasn't just taking my money. The silence that followed said it all. April said I couldn't just cut them off since they needed the money. Nora fired back asking what they needed it for. More vacations and new cars while we patched equipment, with duct tape and delayed house repairs? Dad tried the health card, mentioning his back problems and Mom's heart condition I'd never heard about before. I pointed out that his back seemed fine enough for beach volleyball according to the Instagram posts I'd seen. The caught-in-a-lie look on his face was priceless. And as they prepared to leave, Mom told April, "Don't worry, he'll calm down eventually like he always does." That's when I realized they weren't even taking this seriously. They saw this as just another tantrum they could wait out. I firmly assured them this time was different. We were done. Years of bailing out my parents had left us with almost no savings and a ton of maintenance issues on the farm we'd been putting off. Nora offered to pick up more shifts at the clinic. She works part-time as a nurse and was already crazy busy. "No," I said, "this isn't on you to fix. I'm going to handle it." The next day, I called our family lawyer, Frank, an old-school guy who's handled everything from our property, boundaries, to equipment contracts over the years. I explained the whole situation and asked about my options. "Well," he said, "you could sue them for the money, claiming it was loans rather than gifts, but family courts are messy and it'll cost you to fight it." "But you said your name is still on their property deed as co-owner, right? From when your grandfather left it to both you and your father?" I nodded. My grandfather had put me on the deed because he knew my dad would probably try to sell the land. It was supposed to stay in the family. "Then you have leverage," Frank said. "Use it." One detail I hadn't mentioned earlier, my grandfather, who was 10 times the man my father ever was, left the family property to both me and Dad. He knew what kind of person his son was, so he made sure my name was on the deed too. Dad had been trying to get me to sign it over fully to him for years. Now I understood why. He wanted to sell it off piece by piece, like he'd already done with most of the original farmland. I drove to my parents' place the next morning. They lived on what was left of my grandfather's original 120-acre farm. They'd sold off most of the farmland years ago for quick cash, but the house and about 15 acres remained. They tried to act like nothing had happened. Mom offered coffee. Dad asked about spring planting like it was just another normal day. I cut right to the chase. "I want you to sign a promissory note for the money you owe me, or I'm forcing a partition sale on this property." Their faces went white, ghost-level pale. "You wouldn't," my dad whispered. "Try me," I replied. "I've got 3 documented offers from developers who'd love to build here. One call and we start the process." "But this is our home," my mom cried. "Your grandfather wanted it to stay in the family, and I wanted parents who didn't steal from their grandkids' future," I shot back. "Guess we're both disappointed." I laid out the terms. They'd sign a legally binding agreement to pay back $800 a month until the debt was cleared. No more emergencies, no more handouts. If they missed even one payment, I'd trigger the partition sale immediately. "We can't afford $800 a month on our fixed income," my dad protested. "Funny how you could afford a last-minute trip to the Bahamas, though," I said coldly. "Figure it out. Or maybe ask your golden child to sell some of those designer bags back." Dad started with the excuses. Pension wasn't enough. Medical bills, needed to help April with the grandkids. I just stared at him until he ran out of steam. Mom tried tears next, but they bounced right off me. Funny how quickly you become immune to manipulation tactics once you see them clearly. I left the papers with them and told them they had 48 hours to decide. Word travels fast in small towns. Within days, everyone knew something major had gone down. April went on a social media rampage, painting me as an ungrateful son trying to make our elderly parents homeless. Real classy. She posted childhood photos talking about how my parents had sacrificed everything for me, conveniently leaving out how they'd done the bare minimum for me while pouring everything into her. People who actually knew our family saw right through it. Turns out my parents and April had pulled similar stunts with others in town. Borrowed money they never repaid, made up emergencies, played the victim when called out. I wasn't the only one they'd scammed. My mom's sister, Aunt Karen, actually called to thank me, saying someone finally stood up to them. She spilled the tea on how my parents had borrowed $12,000 from her late husband for medical bills, right before taking a Mediterranean cruise. When he asked for repayment, they acted offended that he would dare ask for it back when family helps family. Sound familiar? 3 days after my ultimatum, Frank called. My parents had signed the agreement. They didn't really have a choice. That afternoon, April showed up at the farm alone, screeching into our driveway in her expensive SUV. I was repairing a tractor and ignored her as she stormed over. She immediately started blaming me for putting Mom on anxiety medication. Without looking up from my work, I calmly pointed out that Mom and April's enabling were the only ones responsible for the situation. April tried every manipulation tactic in the book. Guilt trip about how they raised me, denial that the vacation was theft, then a sweeter tone about how they really needed help and Dad's pension wasn't enough. I suggested she sell some of the designer bags she was always posting about. Her mask dropped completely. Then she called me a selfish prick and said our parents should have stopped at one child. I pointed out the irony that somehow I was the only child they ever asked for money from. That's when she exploded, ranting about how I was lucky to have the farm and a wife who stuck around while she had to struggle. The truth hit me like a truck. April was jealous, not just of the farm, but of the stable life Nora and I had built, things she'd never managed, despite all the advantages and favoritism. I told her I wasn't going to set myself on fire to keep them all warm anymore. For a split second, I almost felt sorry for her when her voice cracked, saying there was no other way. Then she tried one last pathetic attempt at leverage. Mom was writing me out of the will. I actually laughed at that worthless threat. What were they going to leave me? More debt? She stormed off, slamming her car door so hard I thought the window might shatter. 2 months went by. Spring turned to early summer. The first payment came in right on time. Then the second. I was starting to think they'd actually follow through. Then came the third month. No payment, no calls, nothing. After waiting a week, I called Frank. He started the partition sale process immediately, just as we'd agreed. 3 days later, my parents and April showed up at the farm, all three in full panic mode. April screamed that I couldn't do this as soon as I opened the door. I calmly informed her it was already done. The paperwork had been filed that morning. Dad tried pleading they just needed more time because things were tight. I reminded him the agreement was crystal clear. One missed payment triggered this exact consequence. Mom pushed past him, begging about the house being all they had and demanding to know where they would go. I coldly reminded her that wasn't my problem. Maybe they could move in with their favorite child. The look of horror on April's face was priceless. Apparently her generosity only extended to spending other people's money. Dad desperately asked what they needed to do to stop this. I'd been planning for this moment for weeks and knew exactly what I wanted. The full amount, all of it, right now. Mom cried out that was impossible since they didn't have that kind of money. I pointed out April did. All those designer clothes, bags, the SUV, vacations, sell it all. April went pale, protesting that wasn't fair because it was her stuff. I reminded her it was bought with my money that was meant for my daughter's future. My parents exchanged desperate looks before Dad mentioned their savings and a life insurance policy they could cash out. maybe half the amount. I rejected it as insufficient. Mom desperately suggested signing over their portion of the property to me, the house and remaining acres, worth at least what they owed. This interested me. The property was worth considerably more than their debt. When I coldly asked where they would live, Dad looked physically ill at the thought of an apartment in town or a mobile home they could afford on their pension. I pretended to consider their offer, then demanded something else, public acknowledgement. They would post on social media exactly what happened, the furnace lie, stealing Zoe's college fund for vacation, everything. April protested this would humiliate them. Exactly, I responded. Just like you tried to humiliate me with your lies about the farm failing. My parents looked completely broken, exactly how I'd felt for years. They finally agreed to everything. The following day, they signed over their property share to me. The day after, Mom posted a painfully detailed confession on Facebook. She tried to soften parts, but I made her edit it until it told the complete ugly truth. The town's reaction exceeded my expectations. People were disgusted. Church friends stopped calling. April's volunteer position at her kids' private school suddenly faced concerns from administration. My inbox was flooded with messages from people sharing similar stories about my family's manipulation tactics. I allowed them 2 weeks in the house while they found a new place. They ended up in a sad one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, all they could afford. Watching them pack was indescribably satisfying. Dad made one final attempt on moving day, asking if we could work something out since the apartment was barely big enough and in a bad area. I reminded him he should have thought about that before stealing from his granddaughter. As they drove away in their packed car, I felt lighter than I had in years. Instead of selling the property, Nora and I renovated the old farmhouse into a vacation rental. Our area was becoming popular with tourists seeking authentic farm experiences. The irony was perfect. The house they desperately wanted to keep now generated steady income for us. 6 months passed. Life was good. The farm was thriving now that we could actually reinvest our profits instead of handing them over to my parents. We'd expanded the apple orchard and added a small pumpkin patch that became a hit with local families in the fall. We also installed a high-efficiency irrigation system that cut our water costs by nearly 30%. I bought that used John Deere tractor I'd been eyeing for 3 years but could never afford. Nora's clinic hours went from desperately needed income to works when she wants to. Zoe got enrolled in that summer camp, plus swim lessons and ballet classes. Everything was looking up. Then one rainy Tuesday, April called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Her voice sounded uncharacteristically humble as she brought up Mom and Dad. They weren't doing well. Dad's health declining, Mom's depression worsening, the apartment making them sick with mold and noise. I cut her off with a cold, not my problem. She sighed and admitted she knew they'd been terrible parents and she'd been a terrible sister, but insisted they were still family. When she asked if they could move back to the farmhouse temporarily, I actually laughed. I asked where she'd been during their suffering. Was her house too small? After a long pause, she admitted they'd stayed with her for a week, but it didn't work out. Translation, she couldn't stand having them underfoot either. I flatly refused, explaining the house was booked solid with paying guests bringing in more money per weekend than they ever paid me in monthly installments. When she demanded how I could be so cold to my own parents, I simply replied, I'd learned from their example over 35 years. She hung up. My phone immediately exploded with texts calling me heartless and cruel. I sent back a single reply, like mother, like son. Then I blocked her number. A week later, my dad showed up at the farm looking thinner and older. I was fixing a fence on the property line when I spotted his rusty sedan pulling up. I let him follow me to the barn but didn't invite him into the house. After an awkward silence, he claimed Mom wasn't well, something about her heart and stress. When I asked if the stress was from not having access to my bank account anymore, he flinched visibly. He admitted they'd made terrible mistakes. When he asked for mercy rather than forgiveness, saying the apartment was killing them slowly, I asked if April was helping. Predictably, she claimed she couldn't because of her kids' school tuition. Funny how that works. Dad stared at the ground and admitted they didn't deserve help but were desperate. He offered to do anything, even work on the farm. My once proud father was literally begging for scraps. I pointed out that if he'd ever been honest instead of manipulative, things might have been different. But admitting he needed me would have meant acknowledging I had something he didn't, and his ego couldn't handle that. Tears streamed down his face. Good. I made him sweat for 2 weeks before calling with a decision I'd worked out with Nora. I offered the small caretaker's cottage on the back of the property for quiet, reasonable rent. When he hopefully asked about the rent, expecting it to be free, I told him $600 monthly with utilities included, non-negotiable. He swallowed hard and protested about their fixed income. I suggested he get creative and pointed out the orchard needed seasonal help at $15 an hour. After a long pause, he accepted my terms. I added one final condition: April was permanently banned from the property. He quietly noted she wouldn't like that. I didn't care. They moved in the following weekend. The cottage was basic but clean, far better than they deserved. Mom tried to hug me when they arrived. I stepped back. I made it crystal clear this wasn't forgiveness, but strictly business. Pay rent on time, follow the rules, or get out. Dad nudged Mom when she tried to argue. Watching my dad, with his bad back that had miraculously healed, carry boxes from their car to the cottage was oddly satisfying. This man who'd claimed disability for years when I needed help on the farm was suddenly capable of manual labor when he had no other choice. Mom mostly stayed in the cottage, occasionally tending a small garden. Dad actually started helping with the orchard. Turns out his back worked just fine when he had no other options. April was furious about the property ban. She tried sneaking in once when I was in town. Nora caught her and called the sheriff. The look on April's face when Deputy Wilson escorted her off the property was absolutely priceless. She tried calling and texting Nora after that, claiming she just wanted to see our parents. Nora blocked her too. The farm flourished that year. We upgraded equipment, expanded operations, and even hired 2 more workers. Tourists loved the vacation rental, especially during apple season when families could pick their own fruit. We added a small farm stand that became surprisingly profitable. Meanwhile, my parents existed on the periphery of our success, like ghosts haunting their past mistakes. Sometimes when working late in the fields, I'd spot Dad watching from the cottage porch. He'd raise his hand in a tentative wave. Sometimes I waved back. Most times I didn't. The sweet revenge wasn't just getting the property or seeing them humbled. It was forcing them to witness every single day our family thriving without them. They had front row seats to the happy life they were no longer part of, close enough to see it, but never to join it. During that year's harvest, we had a record yield. I bought Zoe the playhouse she'd been asking for, and set it up right where my parents could see it from their cottage. Every time they watched her playing happily in it, they were reminded of all the things they could have been part of if they hadn't seen me as just an ATM. The vacation rental became so popular we had to hire someone just to manage the bookings. The irony wasn't lost on me. The house my parents had treated as their personal property was now funding my daughter's future instead of April's shopping habits. One day in late autumn, as I was finishing up harvesting the last of the pumpkins, Dad approached me hesitantly. He'd been working in the orchard for almost 3 months by then, never missing a day. For a guy in his 60s with a supposedly bad back, he was surprisingly capable. He handed me an envelope. Inside was every penny of that month's rent, plus an extra $100. For Zoe, he said quietly, for her college fund. I stared at him for a long moment. "This doesn't fix anything," I said finally. He nodded and turned to go, but before he walked away, I added, "But it's a start." That night, Nora asked if I regretted any of it. The confrontation, the legal agreement, the public humiliation. I told her honestly that I only regret not doing it sooner. All those years wasted trying to buy their love when I should have been investing in my own family's future. As for April, she eventually found herself in financial trouble when her newest boyfriend left her high and dry. Without access to my money and without her own financial skills, she had to downsize significantly. Last I heard, she was working retail and complaining about how unfair life was. I'm sure she'll land on her feet, she always does, but this time it won't be on my dime. The following spring, I noticed Dad had planted a small garden outside their cottage. Mom started leaving baked goods on our porch, never when we were home, just quietly left there. I didn't acknowledge them at first, but eventually I stopped throwing them away. Baby steps. Life's too short to keep investing in people who see you as nothing but a walking wallet. Sometimes the best revenge is building a life they can't touch. A life so full of real connection there's no room left for their poison. And let me tell you, watching them live with the consequences of their actions tastes sweeter than any apple we've ever grown.